Greetings everyone and welcome to the virtual office hours. My name is John Fia. I teach history here at Messiah College. Abby Blakeney, our producer, is behind the camera. Have the founding fathers with us today, as usual, including our bobblehead George Washington. And we are continuing to discuss this idea of America as a Christian nation and how Americans have perceived themselves as living in a Christian nation. Some of you know we've been trying to follow some of the arguments in my book, Was America Founded as a Christian Nation? A historical introduction. Hopefully we'll have that out in a second edition in July, so I thought we would return to some of these ideas. What we've been doing in the last 7, 8, 9, 10 weeks, this is episode 11, we've been tracing the notion of America, how people perceived themselves to be living in a Christian nation through much of American history. And we are right now smack dab in the middle of the 20th century. You may recall last week we talked about the neo-evangelical movement and their vision to create a Christian civilization in the United States. But there are other Protestants, of course, in the United States in the mid-20th century. We often describe them as mainline Protestants. Some might say liberal Protestants. And we talked a little bit about these modernists or these descendants of modernism back in when we were talking about the early 20th century and the late 19th century and how they wanted to accommodate their Christian faith to modern thinking, modern ideas, the modern age, so to speak. And of course we know after 1925 it is these Protestant mainliners, or these Protestant liberals, if you will, that actually win control of most major Protestant denominations. So moving into the 1930s, 40s, 50s, even into the 1960s, when you think about Protestantism in America, the custodians, if you will, the moral custodians of Protestantism are going to be these mainline denominations rather than the evangelicals or the fundamentalists who have sort of either gone into their separatist enclaves or into hiding in some way, only to reemerge again in the 40s and 50s. Last week we talked about how the evangelicals were very, very convinced that part of their mission was to create a Christian nation. Now today it's mostly evangelicals, especially conservative evangelicals connected with the GOP, the Republican Party, who are pushing for the idea that America should be a Christian nation. We see it all the time in the news so far, especially in this election cycle, in the response to Muslims and refugees and so forth. But what's fascinating historically is the Protestant mainline, is also very much concerned about America being a Christian, if not a Protestant nation in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, perhaps in the way that they are not today. One great example of this, if we can zero in on a sort of window into the Protestant mainline culture on this sort of sense of nationalism, is an article published in the 1940s by Charles Clayton Morrison, who was the editor of Christian Century magazine, which was the main voice for Protestants during this period. And I think it's 47, 48, I could be wrong. Morrison writes a 13-part series in the Christian Century entitled, Can Protestantism Win America? Now it's kind of a strange title because Protestantism in various forms has always been dominant in America up until this point. But the reason why Morrison at this point sees it necessary to devote 13 issues to this topic is he's also perceiving threats to the good Protestant Christian nation that Christian Century and the mainliners have been guarding and protecting. And he sees three threats. He's worried about public schools. He's worried about the role of Christianity and religion in public schools, and that the Bible is not going to be respected, that Protestantism no longer has a strong hold upon the public education system in the United States. Again, this is well before the 1960 cases that removed prayer and Bible reading from public schools. Secondly, Morrison is very worried about science. He's worried about the threat of evolution, the threat of explaining the world scientifically without God. Now again, even Protestant liberals are concerned about atheism or again, the Enlightenment or scientific approaches to explaining human nature without God. They are actually still Protestant, in their ideas. We can't remember that, and many of them still have a significant place for the Bible. And then third, Morrison is very concerned with popular culture. He's sensing a sort of coarseness in the popular culture. He's worried about the youth of America, the things that they're being exposed to in music, in the burgeoning, in radio, and eventually television. All kinds of other things that they're being exposed to in their everyday lives as teenagers and young adults that could threaten the Protestant nature of society. So in the last 2 weeks, we've looked at Protestants. Last week, evangelicals, and how they are trying to promote a Christian nation. But Protestant mainliners in the 40s and 50s and 60s are just as concerned with this. We're making our way through the 20th century here. We only have a few more episodes left in the season, but hopefully we'll bring it up to the present by the time we finish for holiday break, Christmas break. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.